In the last years of the 1910s, a new societal revolution began, fueled by the fact that for the first time, more than half of the U.S. population lived in cities. This revolution gave rise to a time period which would be known as the New Era, and also to modernism and consumerism. This time was marked by a newfound widespread access to electricity and automobiles, and a new proliferation of advertising. Stores began offering easy credit, and chain stores began threatening neighborhood stores by offering a much wider variety of products at a drastically decreased price. A symbol of modernism in the 1920s was the modern woman, known as the flapper. Movies, novels, automobiles, and dance all encouraged greater promiscuity, leading to the proliferation of flappers. The flapper look included knee-hemmed skirts, short hair, and a semi-androgynous look overall. Many flappers smoked cigarettes and drove automobiles, things that were in the past meant only for men. With the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women gained the right to vote. This led to divorce reform, which gave women more rights and freedoms in marriage. The 1920s was an era of new technologies improving the life for many Americans. Automobiles for the first time became inexpensive enough for the average American to afford. Henry Ford's use of the assembly line soon led to Model Ts outnumbering horse and carriages on America's roads. The Wright brothers, among other engineers in the past 2 decades, had pioneered flight. However, in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh brought flight into the American forefront with his first solo navigation across the Atlantic Ocean. Oil became used in factories, replacing coal, and also in rapidly growing number of automobiles. Electricity was now used in new household appliances and in factory electric motors, replacing other methods of heating and power.
Don't mean a thing.
The most popular name for the 1920s is the Jazz Age. African Americans brought their music up from the South, which combined with ragtime, the popular music of the 19-teens, to form jazz. It became a symbol of modern culture. One of the reasons it became so popular was with the proliferation of radios. Not only those in the city could listen, but also those in the country as well, making it a national phenomenon. Also, more robust methods of recording music helped jazz and made the 1920s the first true decade of modern music. Famous jazz musicians include Louis Armstrong, the most famous African-American trumpet player, Duke Ellington, the father of the big band, and Bix Beiderbecke, another trumpet player who created a different style. Louis Armstrong and Bix Beiderbecke are considered the fathers of 2 different styles of jazz music. In the 1920s, radio first became popular. Radio was the first mass media medium. Beforehand, the only way to reach large numbers of people was to use the newspaper. CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, NBC, the National Broadcasting Corporation, and others were large radio corporations that still exist today. Shows on the radio were often sponsored or even produced by companies looking for advertising, and the shows on the radio were as varied as shows on the TV are today. In 1920, radio started with just a few thousand listeners. By 1930, people had realized the potential and the convenience of this technology, and over 10 million radios were broadcast to nationwide by 1930. Hollywood also boomed in the 1920s. Hollywood movies were made, and stars lived in Hollywood, California, and this became the symbol of this new industry. The first half of the 1920s was the era of the silent film. Eventually, though, in 1927, talkies were introduced, with the new audio recording capabilities being incorporated into films. By 1929, 80 million tickets were being sold per week to Hollywood films. This heralded an age where Hollywood stars became the new role models. In the past, political figures such as William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson were the heroes of the nation, but now, Hollywood stars took on that role. Broadway also experienced a golden age during this time. Jewish immigrants, such as George Gershwin, had a huge influence on musical theater. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue and Porgy and Bess incorporated jazz and classical music together. Movie versions of Broadway plays also had a huge influence because they showed Broadway's majesty to the nation. This also helped Broadway musicals have a huge influence over dance music. This rise in mass media also created huge sports stars such as Babe Ruth and Jim Thorpe, and mass media created national followings. The art of the 1920s was characterized by Art Deco, a style with simple curves and streamlining. Architecture such as the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building demonstrated this new style in the 1920s, but also more everyday items were given this aesthetic appeal. This helped give rise to the new profession of industrial design, combining art and technology to make everyday items aesthetically pleasing. In the late 19-teens, the sale of alcohol and the manufacture of it became illegal due to the temperance crusaders of the Progressive Era. Despite this, many people attended speakeasies, which were illegal secret bars where people still sold and consumed alcohol. Even politicians who claimed to oppose prohibition often drank in private. Bootleggers, the smugglers of alcohol, often smuggled it from Canada, and this organization really bankrolled the organized crime lords such as Al Capone, and made gangs a prominent feature of the 1920s as well.
In response to the consumerist culture following World War I and into the 1920s, a group of artists, poets, and authors including F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and John Steinbeck became part of what is known as the Lost Generation, opposed to popular culture. This group scorned religious views as hypocritical, condemned war as a front for big business, and became disillusioned with consumerism. Between 1916 and 1930, over 1.6 million African Americans traveled north in search of jobs. This became known as the Great Migration. While the migration was partially fueled by jobs, it was also fueled by faltering race relations in the South, boll weevil infestations destroying the cotton crop, and new job openings in the North following the World War I draft of white workers. As a result of the Great Migration, a large population of African Americans moved to the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, beginning a movement called the Harlem Renaissance. This included poets such as Langston Hughes, writers such as Counterculture, and painters such as Henry Bernard. The Harlem Renaissance created a dramatic growth in black culture and African American pride. Many black jazz musicians became widely popular in cities such as New Orleans, Chicago, and New York City. By playing in both black, white, and mixed-race clubs, this promoted some respect across racial barriers. During this time period, many African American political groups both grew and diversified. Marcus Garvey led the Back to Africa movement, which promoted black nationalism and became a model for later movements such as Malcolm X's Black Muslims group. The NAACP, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, became the nation's largest civil rights organization during this time period, and remains so today. This group rejected Garvey's Back to Africa motion, but did support racial pride. Despite these new political groups, discrimination and racism still remained very prominent in society. The Ku Klux Klan and films such as Birth of a Nation supported white supremacy, and were both very popular during this time period.
Religious moralists rose in opposition to the new values of society, blaming automobiles, music, dance, movies, and fashion for a breakdown of traditional morals. Another religious response to the new changes in society was modernism and the social gospel. These people accepted contemporary views without abandoning their faith. These views included evolution, increased women's rights, and others. These were predominantly urban people. Fundamentalism was the anti-modernist view, and it centered around a literal interpretation of the Bible. Strictly creationist, it blamed liberal views for declining morals, like the moralists, and was especially rural and southern. New religious views were spread via the radio, especially those of fundamentalism, and they were revivalists much like the preachers of the Second Great Awakening or the First Great Awakening. Billy Sunday was one example. He attacked drinking, gambling, and dancing over the radio, and other preachers attacked things like communism and jazz. The conflict between modernists and fundamentalists was characterized by the Scopes monkey trial. At the time, Tennessee outlawed teaching Darwin's theories, but a teacher named Scopes still taught evolution. Fundamentalists prosecuted him with William Jennings Bryan, the famous populist, as their lawyer, and the lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes and modernism. Scopes was convicted, but Darrow was still considered to have the more convincing argument, and really had beaten William Jennings Bryan, even though the jury was biased. The debate still continues into the 21st century, as many people still disagree over evolution and creationism. Prohibition also had some religious connotations. It was mainly a Protestant action, with many Catholic, Irish, and German immigrants opposing the action, so it became a symbol of the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Nativism also resulted from religious perspectives to some degree. Native Protestants and others were opposed to increased Jewish and Catholic immigration after World War I and encouraged isolationism.
That's all there is. There isn't any more.